As most of you know, I choose things that interest me to share with you on a Sunday morning. And some of this information may not be absolutely new to you, but I think it's worth thinking about. So here it goes. It's also written by Jane Rzepka, who was the leading minister of the Church of the Larger Fellowship until her polio resurfaced, and then she had to resign from that position. But she is such a very good writer. The latest on Jesus, and I should say this isn't the very latest on Jesus, because this was done a little while ago, but it's pretty close. One of the religion writers at Newsweek magazine is panic-stricken. He has been investigating the latest scholarship about Jesus, and he can't believe his ears. He's discovered that the experts believe that the real Jesus was no more the child of God than anyone else. They tell him that Jesus was a Jewish peasant, probably illiterate, a compelling itinerant preacher, and social revolutionary. Jesus challenged Roman rulers and Jewish rulers. He may have been peaceful, but he was clearly outspoken. How hard it must have been for the Newsweek journalist, Mr. Russell Watson, to hear that Jesus performed no miracles. He called for an egalitarian kingdom of God, which would manifest itself not in heaven, but here on earth, in the here and now. And he wanted people to experience God directly, unimpeded by hierarchy of temple or state. The scholars would have told Watson that the authorities executed Jesus rather routinely after he caused a disturbance in Jerusalem during Passover, and that Jesus did not physically rise from the dead. Also, that his body was probably buried in a shallow grave. The Newsweek journalist is utterly bewildered by this description of Jesus. He's incredulous. He's horror-struck. He concludes, quote, "If that's who Jesus was, then every important article of the traditional Christian faith goes out the window. No virgin birth, no divine nature, and most devastating of all, no bodily resurrection. This is a portrait of Jesus no one ever encountered in Sunday school." So, I'm reading along there in Newsweek magazine, and I've got to tell you, I get a little agitated myself. No virgin birth, no divine nature, no miracles, no judgment day, no church hierarchy, no divine nature, no bodily resurrection. Unlike Mr. Watson, I'm doing fine so far. The article goes on. Jesus was a spellbinding preacher, a peaceful reformer. He was accepting and loving, and he lived in the hearts of his followers. In fact, I'm doing great with all this until I hit the last sentence where he says, "This is a portrait of Jesus no one ever encountered in Sunday school." Excuse me? I did. That's exactly the Jesus I encountered in Sunday school, right down the line. We learned all about that Jesus when I was a Unitarian child, just as most Unitarian Universalist children do now. Jesus the teacher, Jesus the reformer, Jesus the source of inspiration. As our old Unitarian Sunday school textbook put it in its title, and the title of this text was Jesus the Carpenter's Son, copyrighted in 1945. This book was written by Sophia Foz, one of our greatest religious educators, and it was used for years and years. It paints exactly the portrait of Jesus that Newsweek claims no one ever encountered in Sunday school. Sophia Foz is a pretty big deal for liberal religion. not so much for the down-to-earth picture of Jesus she taught, but for her methodology and her respectful attitude toward children. Listen to what she says to our children about Jesus in 1945. Was Jesus real, or was he just a story person? When he was a baby, did he know that he was different from all other babies? Could Jesus do anything that he wanted to do? Did he die because he wanted to die, or he couldn't help being killed? Why do some people say he is the Son of God? Does God have only one son? These are questions some boys and girls have asked, and they have felt confused. That's the end of her quote. She goes on to encourage children to put their ideas and questions about Jesus into words, to accept only what makes sense to them about Jesus and the Bible, and to take responsibility for their own thoughts. You need to be prepared to question the stories, to keep your minds awake. Ask yourselves, could this have happened? Read for yourselves the verses in the gospel records. Use your own imaginations. Bring Jesus to life, as it were, in your own imagination, so that you will be emotionally stirred as surely as you would have been had you actually been there and heard him. Sophia Foz would be happy to know that she is not alone in approaching the question of Jesus in this spirit. Increasingly, in mainline Christian denominations, scholars do too. It's a funny thing about scholarship. I always thought that you take a subject, Jesus in this case, and you learn more and more and more, and after years of research, ta-da! You have a fairly complete picture. At least you know a whole lot more about him than when you began. But when studying Jesus, the opposite is true. As Robert Funk points out in his book, Honest to Jesus, you think you know the general story of Jesus to begin with, but the more you investigate, the more you discover that a lot of what you thought you knew isn't true, and that the amount of information we can really document about Jesus' life gets smaller and smaller as we learn more and more. As your body of knowledge increases, you find more and more discrepancies between the Jesus portrayed in the Bible stories and the actual historical Jesus. Here's what happens. You read the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you notice they include not one unified account of Jesus' life, but four different interpretations. That's how John Dominic Crossan describes the process in his book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography. Then you read further accounts. You read other Gospels that have been recently discovered as sources, such as the so-called Q Gospel. And you read those Gospels that have been found that have not been included in the Bible. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, found in Upper Egypt in 1945. Then you study cross-cultural anthropology, and then Greco-Roman and Jewish history at the time of Jesus. And instead of lots of new information with which to bolster the stories of the typical picture of Jesus, you are left with a short list of information. The no-frills Jesus, as it was described in The Atlantic some years back. To wit, this is what you learn. Critical scholars agree that Jesus' hometown was Nazareth, and he was probably born there as well, contrary to later legends that assign his birth to Bethlehem to satisfy an ancient prophecy. His mother's name was Mary. Jesus had 4 brothers, and he may have also had some sisters. His native tongue was Aramaic. We do not know whether Jesus could read or write. We do not know whether or not Jesus knew Hebrew. There is now evidence that suggests that he may have been bilingual. Greek was probably his second language. It was learned from the pagan environment that surrounded Galilee. We do not know how long his public career lasted, but the narrative Gospels imply a relatively short period, from 1 to 3 years. In Honest to Jesus, Funk says that Jesus had, quote, no permanent address, no bed to sleep in, and no respect on his home turf. He did not ask people to convert the world and establish a church. Unlike John the Baptist, he did not believe the world was going to end immediately. He did not even call on people to repent, and he did not practice baptism. He may have eaten his last meal with the inner circle of his followers, but he did not initiate what we now call the Eucharist. When I read along in this vein, I have this little nagging voice in the back of my mind asking, yes, this Jesus scholarship is fun, but is it important? Does it really matter? As one generous scholar, Marcus Borg, notes, there are millions of people for whom the older image of Jesus still works, and they have absolutely no need to pay any attention to us. Why would it matter that the real Jesus didn't baptize if baptism offers comfort or renewal to modern-day folk? Who cares if the resurrection was a fabrication born of grief, political necessity, or blind faith, if this serves a hopeful function in society today? Why rain on the parade of people who believe Jesus looked like them and spoke English, the King James Version, in fact, and smelled good and didn't drink and advocated traditional American upscale family life in the suburbs? The daily newspaper gave me an answer to my questions. There was a story a while back about a play in New Jersey, the Passion Play about Jesus' last days, where for the first time in the theater's 82-year run, a black man had been cast as Jesus. 5 tour groups canceled their reservations. Others wanted to reschedule for performances when a white actor played Jesus. After a couple of vague death threats were phoned into the theater, 2 church schools canceled out of fear for the safety of their students. This story of racism is horrifying, that goes without saying, but it is born in part of ignorance. Why in the world would potential members of the audience think that Jesus, a resident of the Middle East, would look like white people in New Jersey? Knowledge, learning, the study of the historical Jesus would have helped here. Knowing the facts would have stopped the appropriation of Jesus by those who use him to promote values thoroughly at odds with what he really stood for. One of the recent scholarly perspectives on Jesus is that he was a social deviant of the sort that we would do well to emulate. He fully accepted his fellow human beings, no matter how disreputable or marginal they seemed in the eyes of society. We are acquiring a deeper awareness that Jesus, quote, kept an open table, end quote. That is to say, again, according to Funk, that, I like this quote, he ate promiscuously with sinners, toll collectors, prostitutes, lepers, and other social misfits and quarantined people. He robbed humankind of all protections and privileges, entitlements, and ethnicities that segregate human beings into categories. Peter Gomez, who wrote The Good Book, goes a little further when he says that inclusion can legitimately be claimed by the poor, persons of color, gays, lesbians, and transgender people, women, and all persons beyond the conventional definitions of Western civilization. When we study the record, when we learn what there is to learn about the historical Jesus, and model ourselves after what's best in his teachings, every Christian and any one of us here who choose to follow his example will see the value of an open table. Studying the historical Jesus is not only academically interesting, but also socially and religiously responsible for all of us who live in Western culture. When a neighbor claims that the Jesus cast in the Passion Play needs to be white, we can state our case. And when Jesus is held up as a spokesperson for reactionary so-called family values, or for the exclusion of non-Christians or gays or people of color or any group at all, we'll know how to shout and protest. We'll fight for that open table. In the words of Robert Funk, again quote, "The Jesus of that alternative world encourages me to celebrate life, to suck the marrow out of existence, to explore and to probe and to experiment, to venture into uncharted seas. He does not set limits on my curiosity, on my drive to challenge every axiom. That same Jesus prompts me to give myself to tasks that exceed, even contradict, my own self-interest. I'm not infrequently startled by the task, or I am not infrequently startled at the tasks I find myself willing to undertake." So, come to think of it, our UU children do learn all that in Sunday school. And I would like to add, since this writing, I don't know if any of you have encountered or read the book Zealot by Reza Aslan. And if you haven't read it, it really is a font of knowing less and also knowing more of the wider context of the life in which Jesus lived. One of the things that had astonished me is that there were lots of preachers like him out there at the time. So it was published in 2013. Again, it's called Zealot, and it's a fascinating read if you haven't read it. Blessed be.